October 7th, 1942, New Caledonia, Southwest Pacific Area. It was nearly 6 p.m. when 5 Company H officers travelled the rough highway of New Caledonia to a French family farm that catered occasional meals for American soldiers. Much of the only highway running from the capital, Noumea, to the far end of the island had been hewn from solid rock. It was a real spring breaker on army vehicles. The farm lay a quarter-mile from the highway, with each side of the lane lined with beautiful royal palms. John Gossett, my company CO, commanding officer, and I had made the dinner reservations the previous afternoon, and we had arrived at the farm just as the husband and wife were in the process of butchering a hog. The wife had been busy collecting the blood dripping from the throat-cut animal, which hung from a hoist. She'd stirred the fluid constantly as she added an additional bit of flour to make blood sausage. Seated the next evening in an airy room next to the porch, we were each served a full bottle of wine as an aperitif. Then came rock oysters, which we were told had been peeled off rocks in the ocean when the tide was out. They were something like barnacles, I thought, but delicious, and they were packed in chipped ice. A question arose. Where did they get the ice? Then we had a salad of vegetables, followed by fried chicken. Next was a pork chop, then a steak, and then dessert. All in all, the 7-course meal required almost 2 hours to consume. When a bottle of wine was emptied, it was instantly replaced with another. Surfeited by the excellent meal and wine, we were all in wonderful spirits until we heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. It had to be trouble, because only one man knew our location. The newcomer was Dick Hamer, a lieutenant recently assigned to our heavy weapons company, the officer we had left in charge of the company while we were absent. He was excited. "I've got real news. We're to pack up for Guadalcanal to load on ships the day after tomorrow. You've got to get back to the company. They've dumped a pile of ordnance and ammunition upon us. I didn't know what to do, so I figured I'd better locate you all." After we paid our hosts, we headed back to our bivouac area to find the company in turmoil. We had 12 extra machine guns to degrease, 2 extra 81mm mortars to clean, scads of ammunition that had to be loaded into belts, and several Tommy guns, Winchester 97 shotguns, and other specialty items to oil and pack. John Gossett turned to me. "I'll run up the hill to battalion headquarters and find out the details. I'll be right back." Minutes later he returned with a long face. It seemed that both our battalion commander and his executive officer had reported to the hospital, supposedly sick. We were to find out later from our battalion surgeon that 11 officers of our regiment had suddenly developed pains, possible appendicitis, or other ailments. As our regiment was a North Dakota National Guard unit, many senior officers had political connections, even down to an occasional captain. In fact, after our arrival in New Caledonia, our regimental commanding officer, a banker in civilian life, was replaced by a West Pointer. Our banker had no experience at running a regiment in combat, but what of the man from the school along the Hudson? He had no combat experience either. My first thought upon John's return was one of relief. Our battalion commander was a loud-mouthed, uncouth drinker, a coward who covered his weakness by bluster and cursing. An additional shock came the next morning when we found he had withheld our 60mm and 81mm mortar training ammunition from us these past months. He had it all stashed inside a fenced enclosure behind his tent. Word had leaked down that our gasoline ration was in reality 4 gallons a day for each vehicle. Our battalion commander had withheld half of this in his enclosure. We would lose scores of barrels of gasoline that he had piled up. The French civilians on New Caledonia would soon find and use them. Also lost to us was our machine gun and rifle practice ammunition. The only conclusion we could reach was that our commander had withheld the supplies for demonstrations to please the big brass when they came around, demonstrations that would never take place. I never forgave him, for we went to Guadalcanal with little or no experience in firing those important weapons. A replacement for the man was not immediately appointed, so my company commander was more or less forced to take over the reins on a temporary basis. He was a leader. We packed and boxed up all night. Tents were struck and cots folded. The 12 extra machine guns were readied for use, and also the mortars and Tommy guns were checked and oiled. Crews finally finished loading many cases of loose ammunition into machine gun belts by 4 a.m. by daylight. Everyone was exhausted and asleep. Shortly after noon, a messenger arrived from regimental headquarters with orders for me to report to the 9-station hospital in Pieta to be evacuated to the States. The month before, I had had a bout of heart trouble after 5 days and nights without sleep while we made repeated forced marches. I had been hospitalized for 2 weeks. I'd been released back to my unit temporarily as wounded Marines from Guadalcanal began to overcrowd the hospital. I was determined to fight with the unit, so I consulted John. "I'm going to the canal with you." "Charlie, you've got to go to the hospital. If I allow you to come with us, I'll qualify for a court-martial." He mused for several moments, then began to smile. "We're to load on the Macaulay, but there's another ship going to the canal, the Zealand. I'll lend you a jeep tonight, and if you can get on that ship, good luck. Heck, I can say I don't know where you went." Hamer, our new officer, decided to accompany me, so after dark we drove to the city of Noumea. As it neared 10 p.m., we approached the docks to find a landing craft that was being loaded under dim pier lights. "Hey, coxswain! Which ship are you headed to?" Over the sudden roar of the craft's motor, as he began to back away, he yelled, "Out to the Xylin! Can we catch a ride with you?" "Sure, climb aboard, but be quick about it." Minutes later, we were at the bow of the Zealand. It was inky dark, but a landing net hung within reach of the small craft. I started the climb up the net with Hamer following, but I ran into difficulty. We were not alongside a vertical wall, but at the tapered bow. Our feet swung in sharply, so that the climb had to be done almost totally by hand. Despite my full pack and rifle, I managed to get to the very edge of the ship's rail before I hesitated. I called down to Hamer, "I'm about played out. How about you?" At that instant, a voice came out of the darkness. "Need some help, Mac?" A hand reached over the rail and literally lifted me over the edge, onto the deck. Lordy, I was thankful. Our hidden benefactor then assisted Hamer, and we both thanked him profusely. He pointed. "Just go through that far hatchway. There are wardrooms along the passage." The first wardroom door was open, and I glimpsed a man wearing dark glasses. He was lying on the bunk nearest the door. I recognized him as Warrant Officer Hall from our service company. "What are you doing here, Hall?" He tipped up his dark glasses and smiled. "They were going to send me home." "Same here." I looked around the room and saw 7 Marine officers, all about my age. They were pilots and intelligence officers on their way to Guadalcanal. "Do you mind if Hamer and I bunk in here with you?" A young lieutenant named Gibbs introduced himself, then presented his fellow Marine officers. "We've 2 spare bunks. You're welcome to them." The Macaulay and the Zealand left October 9th for the canal, accompanied by 3 or 4 destroyers. It was to be a 4-day trip. On our second day upon the ocean, I happened to be standing by a signalman who was operating a blinker light in contact with the Macaulay. He was scribbling on a tablet as he turned to me. "Some guy is going to be happy over this message." A few minutes later, the loudspeaker requested my presence on the bridge. I suspected I was going to be admonished for slipping aboard, but instead a smiling officer handed me a message that read, "You are the father of a healthy baby girl. Love, Lorraine." I knew my wife was expecting soon, but to be notified in this exciting way. The wire was addressed to Sydney, Australia. Someone there had a heart. John had managed to have it forwarded by light signal. That was my company commander, a real prince. On the 3rd day aboard the Xylin, as I sat in the shade, leaning against a hatch cover, I reminisced about the past months spent on New Caledonia. Some good, some not so good. While on a deer hunting trip accompanied by our Protestant chaplain, we'd ventured some miles into the hills from our base camp. It was approaching 7 a.m. when we first heard tremendous rumbling explosions coming from far out on the ocean. I immediately abandoned our hunting plans. My platoon's anti-tank guns would be needed to protect UTO and dummy passes along our ocean frontage from a possible Japanese invasion. As we approached my bivouac area near the Tontuta airfield, I became aware of several Navy fighters circling to land on the Macadam Strip. The fighters were from a carrier that was in serious trouble, and the aircraft were almost out of fuel. The first plane crashed on the strip, necessitating the dispatch of an ambulance. The second, following closely behind, bowled into the lead plane and the ambulance. Another ambulance was dispatched, and a third airplane piled into the lot. The remaining aircraft took to the grass, anywhere they could land. I was not an eyewitness to the accidents, and a veil of secrecy was swept over the matter, so we could obtain no additional information. However, on one of my regular beach patrols with my driver, Blackie Sievers, I noted 2 grey life preservers that had blown ashore. On the back of each was LX in big letters, followed by the words Div 10 underneath. I knew then that the carrier Lexington had gone down. When I returned to the rear area, I described what I had found, but everyone smiled. No one believed such a thing could happen. Some months later, Life magazine came out with photographs of the sinking. Near my platoon bivouac by Tontuta airfield was an old greenhouse. Its owner went into Noumea each Thursday for his quota of wine, which he sold to the troops. He finally became so greedy that men waiting outside his door heard him pouring the wine into a bathtub, thereby doubling the quantity. They quickly cured him of that by burning down his house. My former company commander was a heavy drinker, as was his almost constant companion, the first sergeant. I was called to report one evening and found both well soused. My captain started to curse me about the camouflage on my 437mm gun shields, saying, "I should beat the hell out of you, you damned young whippersnapper." I had taken all the foul crap he had handed out to date, but I finally rebelled at this. I challenged him, "Why don't you try?" He did, only to end up on the ground. Then I challenged the first sergeant, "Mac, come out here and get the same." He was a coward, so I got in my jeep and went back to my platoon near Tontuta. The next morning at 7, a lieutenant appeared and handed me an order. It was a transfer from the anti-tank company to Company H of our regiment as of that day. I was tickled pink. A month later, this captain was reduced in grade to a first lieutenant and transferred elsewhere. I was assigned to take over the first platoon of Company H upon my arrival. The platoon sergeant, Sergeant Hoffman, was a gem. He took me through the .30 caliber Browning water-cooled machine gun from one end to the other. I couldn't understand why he was never selected to go to the officer training school in Noumea, for we were short of officers, and the man was excellent officer material. Perhaps it was because the present commander of Company H was afraid of losing good men. Back on July 3rd, our battalion commander ordered all 5 companies to the beach area to participate in a baseball tournament on the afternoon of the 4th. During my first few days with Company H, I sensed a current of animosity toward the company commander. In addition, I found the men also had no respect for the battalion commander. When 10 a.m. came on the 4th of July, every man in Company H was either drunk or pretended to be. The battalion commander arrived, red-faced and yelling, "Break every non-com in the company! I'll show the bastards!" The officers of the company were shocked, but we kept our mouths shut. Our captain did that foolish thing. He broke every non-com in the company to private. When word of this action reached regimental headquarters, the very next morning a new captain arrived to take over command. Immediately, Captain John Gossett reinstated every non-com. The company now had a real commander. There was no bluster to this man. He spoke calmly, but you knew he meant business. He consulted with each officer in turn, asking about our education and experience. I felt a world of confidence in this man. When daylight came on October 13th, many of us were on deck eyeing Savo Island and the mainland of Guadalcanal. The weather was exceptional. As we neared land, the ships headed straight to shore, bows almost touching the beach. We were to find after we landed that the Marines held only a small perimeter, an oval perhaps 5 miles along the beach and 2 miles deep. Along this beach for miles stretched Lever Brothers' coconut plantation. Plywood Higgins boats without ramps quickly unloaded the troops. Hamer and I were able to rejoin Company H after a brief search. 1st Platoon was detailed to unload hundreds of cases of gelignite explosive. We had formed a pile about 25 feet square and 4 feet high when word came of a condition yellow. That meant Japanese bombers were on their way, arriving soon. Condition red quickly followed. The approaching Japanese bombers, all 24 of them, were difficult to spot at first because of their high altitude. They were flying in V formations, much like geese. Apparently the enemy was focused on the destruction of Henderson Field, the main airfield on Guadalcanal, named after a Marine aviator. Under scant cover, we heard bombs exploding in the distance. Crump! 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 A minute later, the bombers swung over the beach to drop a few bombs, perhaps 300 or 400 yards from my location. The 164th Infantry lost its first man that morning. A second air raid began overhead about 2 hours later. The enemy again concentrated on the airfield. It became apparent that air raids were to be an everyday occurrence. After condition green sounded, we continued to work, moving gear back from the beach until 5 o'clock, when a large artillery shell struck the sand about 100 feet north of me. Fortunately, a parked Bren gun carrier shielded me from the blast and fragments. More shells came in from the west, alerting crews on the stern guns of the Xylin and Macaulay, who returned fire. The enemy artillery piece was concealed a long distance back along the western shore, so I doubted that they scored any success. Shortly after the artillery duel, we formed up to march inland. A Marine advised me, "Don't let them bivouac you by the airstrip. It catches hell every night." As darkness fell, we passed an ammunition dump that was still burning from one of the air raids. From time to time, the fireworks from it were spectacular. A half-mile farther along the trail, we halted to bed down for the night. I promptly dug a slit trench after checking my platoon. It was dark at the time, with no moon. Somewhere around midnight, I awoke to a horrendous sound. Japanese illumination shells were coming in from the sea, burning brightly with a series of loud, crackling explosions. Each explosion seemed to bounce the flares back and forth in a jerky motion. I rolled into my slit trench, but met opposition. A soldier who had woken earlier had appropriated my hole. After a brief effort to shake him out with cuss words, I gave up and sought other cover. Illuminated in the light of the overhead flares stood a Chevy 1.5-ton truck with a steel cab, only about 50 feet away. I jumped into the cab, but quickly changed my mind when a large fragment of enemy shell struck the truck, shaking it violently. As I abandoned the truck, I spotted a series of what looked like nail kegs. I knew it was a latrine. Just at that moment, a Japanese float plane passed directly overhead and dropped another flare to direct the naval gunfire. About 100 yards away, a parked B-17 bomber burst into flames, adding even more light to the situation. I yelled for help to tear the top off the latrine, and several men who lacked cover jumped to the task. Within seconds, the deep 20-foot-long trench was filled with men, all reasonably safe from the shells, unless we took a direct hit. The soft, mushy bottom of the trench and the vile odour told us plenty, but not an objection was heard. When the shelling ceased and daylight finally came, we threw away our canvas leggings and walked to the nearby ocean. We removed our boots, washed our legs, threw away our socks, and scoured our boots with sand, inside and out. Cruising the beach near Alligator Creek, the name was a misnomer, the creek was loaded with crocodiles, I saw Japanese arms, legs, and torsos buried in the sand, the result of a battle on August 21st, when the Marines had wiped out the Ichiki detachment of the Japanese army. We found to our dismay that we were on the edge of the airfield amid a litter of coconut trees whose tops had been sheared off by the shelling. A short distance away lay several aircraft, nearly all destroyed beyond repair. That afternoon we were told the main shelling had come from 2 battleships with 14-inch guns, assisted by a cruiser and several destroyers. We estimated that at least 800 or more of the 14-inch high explosive shells had been fired, together with an equal or greater number of smaller caliber shells from the escorting ships. Later we referred to this as the Night of the Battleships. On October 14th there were few American aircraft available. Most of the dive bombers had been destroyed in the shelling. Pistol Pete, a 150 Japanese field gun, fired on the airport runway from the enemy-held west, forcing a temporary move to Fighter Strip 1, a short distance southeast of the main strip. That same day, there were 2 more major bombing runs by the enemy, supplemented by another night of shelling from the sea. This time, only 8-inch cruiser fire came in. It was much less terrifying than the huge 14-inch shells. At daylight on October 15th, word came down that several Japanese transports were unloading at Tassafaronga, just 10 miles to our west. As the beach curved, the ships could be easily seen. I counted 4 with the aid of binoculars, but later learned that a 5th had been unloading farther up the coast. I complimented the marine officer. The barbed wire and aprons were wide and high, in excellent condition. They would stop a wild rush of men. No one could get through the many strands of barbed wire without difficulty and would be delayed long enough to be shot. In the left portion of my defensive line there was a good field of fire, perhaps 200 yards. But on the right flank, near the jungle defended by the 7th Marines, the kunai grass was high and as close as 125 yards. It came to me, if I only had old King and Queen, our grey team, back on the farm, together with that old Moline mower, I could easily have widened that field of fire. Later that evening, Captain Gossett stopped by to inspect the final disposition of my guns. He was satisfied, but I noted he entered every gun position to check the sighting on the FPL. He also had a few words for each man in each crew. Due to the shortage of machine gun ammunition, I was forced to limit each gun to 6 belts while holding back a reserve for immediate delivery to any portion of the line under attack. Spare belts and extra grenades were kept in my headquarters tent, just in the centre and rear of the Company E line. The Company H-81 mortars supporting the battalion were located about 800 yards to the rear of our line, with 2 extra mortars in addition to the standard 4. The jeep trail behind our line extended to the juncture of Company E and the Marines. From there, farther west along the Marine line, the trail was mostly a footpath. I made sure our machine guns were securely tied in with the Marines at this junction. My platoon headquarters tent had already been placed for me by the Marine weapons officer I had relieved. It even had a dugout with an inside entrance capable of holding 4 or 5 men. A feeder trail led from the vehicle road, 60 yards to the rear, past the corner of my tent to the front line. Company E 60 mortars were located adjacent to, but several yards northeast of, the tent. We kept the tent side nearest the back trail open. This proved to be a blessing a few nights later. Since we were attached to Company E for rations, our weapons platoon ate 2 meals each day, early morning and late afternoon. The kitchen was located near the centre of the Company E line. During daylight hours, we rotated men so no portion of our defensive position was overly weakened. At night, everyone rotated 2 hours on duty, 2 hours off. We had been told the enemy favoured a night attack. October 16th was devoted to improving gun positions and barbed wire barriers. Tall grass in front of the positions was cut to reduce cover for the enemy. Nuisance air raids became a nightly occurrence, and daylight fighter battles were watched avidly by cheering soldiers. We passed the night with no naval shelling. On October 17th, Company E sent out patrols 3 miles to our front. Old Japanese equipment was found, but no new tracks or signs of movement were seen. All communication was by runner or EE-8 telephone. The Motorola 536 radios previously issued proved almost worthless. The excessive humidity was the culprit. Shortly after noon, 20 bombers hit Henderson Field with fighter support. Again, our cheering section showed enthusiasm. Many Japanese planes were shot down. Enemy bombers flew over Henderson at about 1400 on October 18th. The various aircraft that came over at night dropped an occasional small bomb, which kept us awake. We called them nuisance raids. Frequent small explosions from Henderson Field indicated that Pistol Pete, the Japanese 150 gun to the west, was again working over the runways and parked aircraft. We ate pancakes on October 19th with D-ration chocolate and C rations for the second meal. The usual Japanese bombers with fighter escort attacked Henderson Field. It seemed strange that Washing Machine Charlie, our nightly sleep interrupter, was often caught by searchlights. They lit him up like a white butterfly, but the anti-aircraft couldn't seem to shoot him down. Evidently, the pilot could see the gun flashes on the ground and took evasive action. October 20th was another typical day. Company E patrolled, and we had bombers overhead at noon. Our pilots were shooting down a lot of enemy aircraft, both Zeros and Bettys. On October 21st, we had our first bomber raid at 11 a.m. and another at 5 p.m. Details of men dug small circular trenches along the proposed emergency airstrip on October 22nd. A 4-foot centre was left to support a machine gun. My platoon dug these positions in the rear of our wire apron. The Japanese must have had lots of aircraft. They came over several times during the day and were being shot down in growing numbers. On October 23rd, Japanese bombers flew over again, this time with fighter escort. I heard Marine artillery heavily shelling in the Matanikau and Point Cruz area to the west. The Marines must have been having trouble there. Japanese 150 mm guns shelled Henderson until noon. October 24th was uneventful, and no information came down the chain of command. This wasn't unusual, since we were seldom given vital information. Those above probably thought we didn't need to know. Was it jealousy between the services? Perhaps it was the Marine way. But how wrong they were. We wanted to be informed. It should have been our privilege. The commanders took our cameras away from us, and we couldn't keep diaries. Why? It seemed every officer, from lieutenant colonel to general, had been seen carrying a camera. Rank seemed to have its privileges. The men had little respect for these officers. Evidently, from the vast amount of artillery fire near the Matanikau, the Japanese main thrust seemed to be there. I believed the Marines thought so too. Why else remove a battalion of the 7th Marines from their line next to us? In fact, we were not even privy to the fact that a Marine patrol of nearly 40 men had been sent to outpost a small hill 1,000 yards to our right front. From there, they had a telephone hookup back to their unit. Such was the lack of communication between the Marines and Army. It was near dusk that evening of October 24th when my platoon sergeant, Dick Hoffman, and I heard McCarthy's machine gun open fire. We also heard heavy rifle fire, then a sudden loud report that I suspected came from the Marine 37 mm anti-tank gun. It seemed that McCarthy's gun would never cease firing, indicating he would soon be out of ammunition. Turning to Dick, I said, "Let's grab all the ammo belts we can carry and get them down the line." "Going to take the back trail?" "No way. We'll go along the front-line positions. The men will be plenty trigger-happy as it is." Each of us carried several belts of machine gun ammunition and started down the line. Calling ahead, we warned that we were carrying ammunition toward the firefight, injecting a few choice cuss words so the men on the line wouldn't mistake us for English-speaking Japanese. When we finally reached the rear of McCarthy's dugout, I poked my head inside to find out what was going on. McCarthy clued me in. Japanese came along the edge of the bush in a column of twos, straight toward us. When they reached the barbed wire, they stopped in confusion. At first we thought they might be a Marine patrol, but they were so close we knew they were enemy. When I yelled, "Password!" you should have seen the cigarettes fly. Heck, most of them were smoking. Just as we left McCarthy's position, all hell broke loose. It seemed that more Japanese had moved up to the wire. Bullets were flying everywhere. Abrupt 81 mm fire was landing out in front of the wire from our Company H mortars. A Japanese mortar shell struck a tree overhead. The explosion was a big red flash. We didn't know that 100 or more Japanese in the jungle section in front of the Marines had broken through their thin line and were in the rear of our positions. When I heard this the next morning, I was glad we hadn't taken the jeep trail. The final protective lines worked well. Later, we found enemy piled 3 or 4 deep at the front edge of our wire, stopped by constant machine gun fire when they charged us. Sporadic American artillery fire joined the devastation caused by the 81 mm and 60 mm mortars. Nothing could live in that approximately 2-block square area of impact. Company H mortars fired 1,600 rounds that first night. The mortar tubes were red hot. Finally, 2 of the tubes failed to dislodge high explosive shells dropped into them. The shells were stuck fast. That meant the shells would soon explode in the tubes from the heat, killing the crew servicing them. The 2 tubes were quickly tossed into existing slit trenches and hastily covered with dirt. Fortunately, the shells did not explode, but the mortar tubes remain buried on Guadalcanal to this day. By keeping track of the firing on the line and the ammo we had delivered, we knew McCarthy was adequately provisioned until near daylight. Our first delivery of ammunition had been about 10:30 p.m. At about 3:30 a.m., we started out with a second load. Rifle and machine gun fire was heavy, coming in and going out. When Dick and I reached McCarthy's position on our third trip, we handed belt after belt through the back entrance before I noticed a dead man just to the left of McCarthy's position. I recognized the man. "Mac! What happened to Flynn?" "He caught one. Cripes, the bullets are as thick as flies on horse shit. Watch yourself." I reached into my pocket for a handkerchief and covered Flynn's face. Then I moved around his body to the left edge of McCarthy's position and endeavoured to look out to the front. In the dim light, I could see bodies and more bodies. Some were heaped on the barbed wire, which sagged in many places from their weight. Suddenly, shouting came from the tall kunai grass directly across from our guns. It came from Marines who had been trapped at their outpost in front of us. They were endeavouring to get back to the American lines. Many had gone farther east to enter our lines where there was no action, but these Marines had evidently gotten lost and were mixed with Japanese troops in the kunai grass. Out of the growing light, 30 yards to my front, 3 men stood up. At first I thought they were our troops. I called to McCarthy, "Who are they?" "Why, those cheeky fools!" he exclaimed. We both levelled on them and dropped all 3. Somehow they had gotten through our apron wire and had hidden in one of our newly dug anti-aircraft positions. Later, I judged that the yelling must have indicated that we wanted to surrender. At least that was my hypothesis. Otherwise, why would they have stood up? As full daylight came, the Japanese disaster became apparent. Hundreds of bodies lay to our front in the open grass. Our barbed wire was a shambles, and bullets were still flying. The field was a shooting gallery. It was shoot, shoot, and shoot. Many enemy, exposed by the gathering early sunlight, attempted to run back to cover. Very few made it. As Sergeant Dick Hoffman and I moved along the line toward our headquarters tent, our attention was diverted again to the kunai grass 200 yards to our front. Several Marines were seen. They were trying to run across the field of fire to our lines. Japanese were mixed in among them. We yelled to the Marines to cross, that we would cover them. They all made the break, but one fell into our wire. As they reached safety, one Marine turned to run back to his buddy on the wire. He picked up his friend and struggled back with him. His buddy was conscious and actually laughing. "Hey, they got me in the leg!" He looked up at me, still laughing. "I've been plugged 3 times. Golly, I'm entitled to 3 wound stripes." Such was the courage of those Marines. I suspected some of the wounds the Marines suffered came from our own rifle fire, a case of mistaken identity. Just as Sergeant Hoffman and I had nearly reached our position in the line, I heard a Bren carrier roaring down by McCarthy's location. I found that Bob Campbell of our Company H had brought up a carrier to rescue the Marines still mixed with the Japanese in the high grass. McCarthy and 2 other men had jumped into the carrier, which ran across to the Japanese line, defying the odds. Armed with only 1 machine gun on the Bren, McCarthy held off the enemy, enabling the Marines to pile in. Their return trip was made without incident in spite of heavy enemy fire. McCarthy was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the other men Silver Stars for the sortie. Later that morning, our telephone line back to the Company H mortars was cut. A detail was sent to repair the break. They found 4 Japanese infiltrators sound asleep beside the wire. The wire was repaired. During the previous evening and continuing throughout the night, light, intermittent rain showers had occurred. A frantic call had gone out for help from Company A of the 7th Marines. They needed more men. Company E had sent in their 3rd platoon, and Company G in reserve sent their 1st platoon, mixing them among the Marine positions. They'd passed in the rear of Company E and joined the Marines at the juncture. We were not informed of these reinforcements until the next morning. The platoon leaders of both E and G companies were killed, as were others. The fighting was fierce, often hand-to-hand. The next night, one of my friends from Company M and his first sergeant were bayoneted to death. Another major detail was learned the morning of October 25th. The 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, had moved into the Marine line at about 2 a.m. From then on, the battle in that area took on a new dimension. After I checked my line that morning, I passed into the line held by our 3rd Battalion and was amazed to hear Japanese and Americans yelling back and forth at each other. I heard Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor vilified by the Japanese, while our troops yelled back, "Tojo and the Emperor eat shit!" Surprisingly, one Japanese soldier spoke fair English. Shelling had ceased after sunup, except for an occasional mortar round, but sniping was constant and fierce. Everyone who had to move either crawled or crouched over on the run. On my way back to McCarthy's gun, I stopped at the .50 caliber machine gun position between the battalions. The men there pointed out a Japanese officer 20 feet in front of their gun. Evidently, a tracer .50 caliber bullet had struck his buttocks, and he was actually burning up, slowly turning to a material like cigarette ash. I never knew a human body could burn so. He and 4 or 5 of his soldiers had nearly overrun the gun before being detected amid the noise of battle. A second 37mm anti-tank gun was being cautiously installed alongside the first, as was another .50 caliber machine gun. Preparations for that night looked much better, except for our barbed wire, which was now practically gone. There also seemed to be a shortage of ammunition for the mortars and artillery. Shortly after full daylight, we heard a twin-engine Betty approaching. It skimmed the treetops directly over us, headed toward the airfield. Big red meatballs painted on the underside of the large wings stood out clearly. Later in the day, we found it was shot down by ground fire as it passed over Henderson Field. We wondered at the time what the pilot was thinking, coming in so low. Later, we were told the Japanese headquarters at Rabaul had been informed by radio that our attackers had captured the airfield. Johnny Divers, one of McCarthy's machine gun crew, came to me with a ruptured flash hider from their machine gun. "We've used up 2, and that's all we have. They get red hot from the constant firing, then blow out. Anyone out front can spot our gun now." "John, go back to the company CP and see Captain Gossett. If he can't get you some from the Marines, maybe you can make one out of those empty 37mm casings." Later in the day, we found the casings worked, but didn't last long because the brass was too soft. They blew out after only a few bursts of the gun. The Japanese must have been totally frustrated. They made at least 7 bombing and strafing attacks on Henderson Field. This was the biggest day yet, for our pilots and anti-aircraft shot down nearly 30 enemy aircraft. The ground attacks began early in the evening, mainly against the same juncture of our Company E and the 3rd Battalion of our regiment, which had replaced the 7th Marines. The remaining men of the 7th Marines had been moved farther to the west. The enemy attacked in groups, and as quickly as one group was mowed down, another moved up. By this time our brass realized this was the enemy's main thrust, and did their best to line up every weapon. For brief, short periods, the din was terrific. 2 anti-tank guns firing canister, gigantic shotguns with steel pellets, 2 .50 caliber machine guns, many .30 caliber machine guns, 60mm and 81mm mortars, and practically all the artillery that could be safely spared. We found later that the Japanese had committed their crack units, the 29th Infantry, followed by the 16th Infantry during the 2 nights of the battle. They failed with horrible losses and withdrew for another try the next day. The 3rd day of battle began at dusk, although sniper fire and mortar rounds were frequent during the day. Artillery fire was adjusted in front of the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry, as the jungle was thick and the enemy hard to see. They had no decent fields of fire. A final attack near daylight on October 27th by the 16th Infantry was quickly beaten off. The 16th Regiment had little luck the past day and night. The North Dakota National Guard troops of the 164th Infantry ruled the battlefield. During this battle on the 26th, the Japanese who had broken through the line during the first night of battle became bothersome. They could not get to the airfield through a secondary line that had been established to fence them in. There was no water in this part of the jungle and little rain. They became desperate because of thirst. On the morning of October 27th, I carelessly walked to the Company E kitchen without my weapon. When I was about 30 feet from the kitchen, a Japanese who had broken through the line shot at my head. A firecracker exploded in front of my nose, and I made a running dive behind some ration boxes at the edge of the kitchen. A few men sitting around the kitchen were alerted when the man wildly fired 4 more shots into the kitchen area from the small bush I had just passed. M1 rifles sprang into action. Everyone emptied an 8-round clip into the bush. As suddenly as the action had begun, it stopped. The men who had fired from positions of leisure calmly reloaded their weapons, as if they had not a care in the world. Finally, someone walked over to the bush, then sauntered back. "He's dead," the man said laconically. The distance from that Japanese to me was but 30 feet. How lucky can you get? I never forgot my weapon again. About noon, a heavy Japanese machine gun cut loose in the vicinity of the Company E command post. The fire came from an area where no action had taken place. The snapping bullets that passed by made one think. Everyone hit the deck, but a stalwart man from Company E took the Japanese gunner to task. The machine gun duel went on for about 10 minutes before the Japanese gun finally fell silent. We guessed the gunner had expended his ammunition, or it had become too hot for him. The Japanese again struck at the sector of Company E at its juncture with the 3rd Battalion. The attacks were sporadic and failed to make headway. The Japanese withdrew at dawn, leaving the field to the usual snipers. A bit of sniper fire opened the day on October 28th, and Company E began to patrol again beyond the left flank. Anti-aircraft positions, dug days earlier by the company, had been occupied by the enemy. Expended machine gun brass cases were plentiful at one position that had been occupied by the gunner who had sprayed the Company E command post area the previous day. Attacks that evening were sporadic and listless. It became apparent that the Japanese had been whipped. After 8 a.m. on October 29th, men began drifting into the battle area to pick up enemy rifles, machine guns, sabres, and anything else of value. It seemed that every American soldier and Marine was a souvenir hunter. Many enemy helmets held a Japanese flag, and most enemy soldiers had wristwatches or pocket watches. Of interest to me was the fact that many of their wristwatches were enclosed within another case for protection. I was one of the guilty, but I collected weapons, machine guns, Bangalore torpedoes for cutting wire, hand grenades, mortars and their shells, and other implements of war. These I sent back to my commanding officer, Captain John Gossett, who had the presence of mind to hide them. At noon, we were required to turn all weapons over to our service company. Later, when I inquired about their security, I found they had all disappeared, stolen by the big shots and back area scuts for personal souvenirs. We had been informed that each man could put his name on an enemy gun, and that would be kept for him. So much for promises. In my search for exotic weapons, I found a 20 mm anti-tank gun with bicycle handles to be carried by 4 men. This was too heavy for me, so I had to forego it, but I did remove several armor-piercing shells for show. Evidently this weapon had not been in position when McCarthy made his foray with the Bren carrier. It would have made hash of that thin-armoured Bren. Perhaps it had been brought up to prevent further incursions. That night was uneventful, except for sporadic shooting by Americans, who took no chances. Most trigger-happy men had been cautioned to tighten up. Still, there were a few who were so tense they couldn't be controlled. I found that being a second lieutenant had its problems. A few men were brilliant leaders, the majority so-so. 1 or 2 of my men were downright quirky. There were other problems. Draft boards in the States, especially in small communities, shipped out undesirables. One man was totally deaf, and another had varicose veins so bad his legs looked like bundles of grapes. I thought that the doctors who examined them should have been drafted. On October 30th, the souvenir hunters congregated. Even the brass from the rear areas finally got the courage to show up now that it was safe. Many of them brought their cameras. They got dirty looks from the men. Air activity did not slow. I'd had no opportunity to travel much up to this time. It was only later that I realized there were so many Japanese aircraft downed that they could be found everywhere. A few crashed planes held bodies. Other Japanese pilots must have used parachutes. Pistol Pete continued to plaster the airfield on October 31st, and dogfights between Americans and Japanese were an everyday occurrence. There were still many Japanese soldiers behind our lines, but their efforts were not coordinated. They harassed us in groups of only a few men. That night, from 10 p.m. to 12 a.m., my runner, Stelk, and I were sleeping while two others had the shift. I awoke to hear Jake say, "If it moves again, I'm going to shoot it." Jake was a cook, sent to me as a replacement. I awoke my runner and said, "Jake is jumpy. We'd better start our shift early." When I asked Jake what was wrong, he said, "It looks like a pig out there. There's noise in the brush." "We'll take over. You two hit the sack." I moved to the rear of the tent to look back toward the jeep trail. The moon was up and visibility was excellent. After a few minutes, I saw the pig too, but it suddenly stood up and approached me silently. It was a Japanese soldier, his rifle with fixed bayonet at high port. He approached me head-on, hesitating momentarily, about 8 feet away. As I was under the edge of the tent, I was invisible to him. The password was Honolulu. When I challenged, he froze, then slowly began to turn back. I had my Riesing submachine gun in my hands, and although I had fired it many times during the day, I had never fired it at night. When I pulled the trigger, a blast of flame instantly blinded me. After a burst of a few rounds, I pulled again and emptied the magazine. I was totally blinded. 4 or 5 seconds went by before my runner fired his M1 rifle. We heard several men running from us, crashing through the brush. One dropped his rifle and pack as he stumbled onto one of our toilet trenches. Puzzled, I asked Stelk, "Why didn't you open fire when I did?" "Cripes, there were 5 or 6 Japanese right behind him." I'd seen only the lead man as he'd approached me straight on. My runner had buck fever. My trust in him was shaken. Minutes later, when I could again accustom my eyes to the moonlight, I saw tiny dots along the trail, almost 30 feet away. I was perplexed. At daylight, I discovered that these were the hobnails on the boots of the enemy soldier, which had been shining in the moonlight. He wore the insignia of a warrant officer. A half-hour later, I heard a tap-tap-tap in the brush behind our tent. Some distance away, I heard the answer, also brushy sounds. The scattered Japanese were trying to regroup. Cicadas on Guadalcanal made a similar clicking sound, but they started out slowly and gradually increased the tempo until almost infinity. These were definitely Japanese. The Japanese had no lockkeeper on the metal scabbard of their bayonets, so they tied a short string to their belts with a bamboo stick 2.5 inches long, which they threaded through the barrel loop of the bayonet to prevent its loss. This was what they were using for signalling, this small stick tapping on the metal scabbard. Any farm boy would notice these things, especially after hearing a male partridge drumming for a mate. His wing beats start slowly, then speed up with each thump. Eventually, the tapping sounds came close together, so Jake and I each popped a pin on a grenade and tossed them toward the sound. To our surprise, several grenades went off, not just our 2. The 60mm mortar crew to our north was also alert. Shortly after daylight, 2 enemy dead were found, one a captain, the other a medic. They had a 50mm grenade launcher in their possession. As daylight approached, I stood in the doorway of the tent and scanned toward the north. As I turned east, I noticed a man furtively moving toward the Company E kitchen. Someone challenged him, and then I heard a shot. The Japanese, evidently an officer, had fired his pistol and wounded an American. Turning, he ran within 35 yards of me, fast through the undergrowth, headed back toward the jungle. I fired a full magazine of 15 rounds at him as he hit the cat claw. Later, I could find no blood. I was bitterly disappointed. Dick Hoffman admonished me later that morning. "Darn you, you shot the zipper off that mosquito bar I bought." I was guilty, but had no way to make it up to him. I just grinned. "Aren't you lucky you weren't sleeping under it?" On October 29th, we received a message from the Marine Corps. "The officers and men of the 1st Marines salute you for a most wonderful piece of work on the nights of 25 and the 26th of October, 1942. Will you please extend our sincere congratulations to all concerned? We are honoured to serve with a unit such as yours. Little did we realise when we turned over our quiet sector to you that you would bear the brunt of an attack so soon. I'm sure you are very proud of the fighting ability demonstrated by your unit, and our hat is off to you. C.B. Cates." Dick Hoffman looked at me quizzically. I wonder what Cates was thinking we were doing on the night of the 24th, sitting on our asses. Or are the Marines going to take credit for those hundreds of Japanese lying dead out in front of our machine guns? We talked it over and decided it was a team effort that won the battle for us. The Company E riflemen protected our machine guns. Without them, we would have been overrun. Our mortars, the 60mm and 81mm, put down such fire that the Japanese soldiers were destroyed almost before they could reach our wire. The artillery reached farther back, killing and disrupting enemy plans before they could be coordinated. The constant sunshine and heat brought changes we hadn't anticipated. 3,500 bloated, deteriorating bodies created a stench that was sickening. We had done our best to bury more than 1,000 of the enemy by dynamiting a gigantic hole in the earth to the east of Coffin Corner as a resting place. Korean labour or slaves imported by the Japanese were used to move the bodies into the moor. Unfortunately, many bodies were not accessible, deep in the jungle, or even farther beyond, near the Maruyama Trail, the attack route taken by the Japanese, named after their commander. We were alerted on the evening of November 3rd to pack up and rejoin Company H, for we were going east on foot to join Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hanneken's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Word came that a Japanese battalion had landed in the Tetere area, and we were to assist in rounding them up. The next morning we went cross-country through 7 to 8 foot high kunai grass. There was no breeze, and the sun was hot. We sweltered in the humid heat. Our 2 canteens of water per man were gone before we reached the area south of Coley Point. We crossed an open, grassy prairie that bordered heavy jungle to our left. On the way, we found an abandoned F-4F Wildcat. Evidently the pilot had had an engine failure, but had made a perfect landing on the grass. Fortunately, a carrier with a water trailer arrived to meet us at 5 p.m. Our battalion drained every drop from the tank. We pressed on until it was nearly dark, stopping about 200 yards from the dense jungle. A slight breeze came to us from these woods, no doubt originating from the ocean, which was only a few miles to the north. The men were exhausted, ready for a night's rest. As our officers gathered together, we looked apprehensively at the dark jungle close by. My hearing was acute, and I was sure I heard faint voices from the bush. "John, I think I hear voices. There must be Japanese there." "Heck," Kenny, our executive officer, said. "I can smell them. They're Japanese, all right." Strange to say, Japanese equipment, especially leather belts and goods, had a peculiar, sweetish odour. Not an unpleasant scent, but not a familiar odour to Americans. Perhaps it was the tanning process, or was it their perspiration? John Gossett spoke up. "Regardless, we'll bed down here tonight. Form your men into a perimeter with the machine guns to cover us, mortars in the centre. I have nothing further to pass on since no one in the battalion has contacted me. I don't even have a map for this operation. I guess we'll find out what's up in the morning." We awoke at dawn on November 5th to open our last 2 cans of sea rations when sudden firing came from our left, just inside the jungle. One of our rifle companies had jumped the gun and moved into the bush, only to find it occupied by the enemy, just as we had suspected. Normally, a platoon of machine guns from our company would be attached to each rifle company, while our 81mm mortars supplied a base of fire for the entire battalion. This day, we hadn't been assigned as yet, because the Japanese weren't supposed to be this close. We were still not across the Nalimbao River. The enemy was supposed to be even farther east, past the Mattapony River. 1st Platoon of H was to join Company E as soon as possible. Upon entering the woods, we ran into sniper fire as we were passing Company F. One of their men caught a bullet from the sniper just as John Gossett and I passed by. John pointed to a far coconut tree. "I saw palm fronds move in the top of that tree over there. The Japanese is in the top." Sergeant Shelley of Company F asked, "You're sure?" "You bet I am. He's up there." The sergeant ran about 40 yards and stopped directly under the tree while we watched. Slowly he moved around its base in a tight circle, then he aimed up and fired. The Japanese hadn't tied himself in, so he fell to the ground almost in slow motion. His rifle followed. It reminded me of a squirrel hunting trip back home, using the trick of placing a jacket for the squirrel to watch while you circle to the other side of the tree. Shelley came back to us with a huge grin. He was unfolding a Japanese flag. Found it in his helmet. About 150 yards away, a Nambu light machine gun cut loose. We found out later that day that Lieutenant Agnew of Company G had caught a burst in the stomach. Our battalion surgeon, Dr. Schatz, crawled in and pulled him to safety. Because of Schatz's courageous action, Agnew survived. Schatz was awarded the Silver Star for his heroism. These Japanese soldiers were not present in large numbers, but the small groups made it difficult to force a decisive fight. Their uniforms were in good condition, evidence that they were part of the battalion that had landed at Coley Point. We pressed through this stretch of jungle and came out on the north side to face another half-mile stretch of grassy field. My platoon joined Company E, and we settled to spend the night in a dry coulee. Lack of water was a problem because the day had been a scorcher. The men dug a well, using steel helmets as shovels in the lowest point of the coulee. As they dug, the hole grew progressively wider due to cave-ins. At about 7 feet, water finally appeared. But what water? It was filthy, with a stink all its own. It was also filled with grit and humus, as the soil was sandy. Still, all canteens were filled and iodine drops inserted. A minimum wait of at least half an hour was required but ignored. Iodine certainly doesn't improve the taste of water. Earlier that afternoon, I had been ordered to patrol out in the grass to the north. We had gotten out about 500 yards when we heard an airplane coming toward us. It was an F-4F Wildcat, and the pilot banked to look us over. If we had been Japanese, we would have been slaughtered. We took off our helmets and waved. He waggled his wings in return. I wanted to push farther north, to the ocean, but my section sergeants began to complain. They thought it stupid and said so vehemently. I foolishly acquiesced, returning with the patrol to the battalion at about 4:30 p.m. After dark, a message arrived by radio. The battalion was to immediately move straight north to the beach. Company E led off with my machine gun platoon following. After crossing the open field, we entered a narrow stretch of jungle. There, a sudden burst of machine gun fire ripped into our column from the north. Then a second gun opened up. One of my section sergeants cried out, "Those are Brownings firing! Our guns!" From the cries up front, we knew several men had been hit before the firing ceased. We had run into our 3rd Battalion, whose machine gunners were so trigger-happy they failed to challenge us. I bore some of the blame because I had let the men talk me out of doing a thorough patrol job. The accident was blamed on lack of communication and failure to challenge, but I never forgave myself. I became a tough, hard-nosed lieutenant from that day on. In any case, this order to move was made by our regimental commander, who should have known better. The short move was absolutely unnecessary. It was nearly 11 p.m. when we reached the beach. After settling down my platoon, I began digging a hole in the sand for cover. Our battalion executive officer, Major Ben Northridge, stopped alongside. "Got a blanket, Charlie?" "Blanket and poncho, sir." "Then I'm bunking in the sand with you. Somehow I lost my pack." When I awoke on the morning of November 6th, Ben was gone, already moving the rifle companies up the beach toward the Nalimbao River. I found my platoon had been attached to Company G for fire support and rations. What rations? The last meal of sea cans had been eaten yesterday morning. I noticed that my 2 section sergeants were avoiding me. I knew then that they felt as guilty as I did about not making a thorough patrol to the ocean. Trudging up the beach while carrying 4 light machine guns, heavy cans of ammunition and grenades became hard work. The tide was fully in, which forced us to walk on soft, loose sand. Again, the sun began to bake us. We finally moved inland to cross the Nalimbao River at a narrow spot. In the centre of this crossing lay an abandoned Bren gun carrier, so overloaded with ammo that the differential had failed. We swung back to the beach as we approached the Metapona River, some 1,000 yards away. Marines at the edge of the jungle shouted to us, "Get off the beach! The Japanese are shelling us with a howitzer!" We had heard no firing, but to prevent an argument, I led the platoon to the edge of the jungle where a Marine platoon was resting. A slight, short Marine lieutenant looked up at us, amazed, and said, "Where did you get those giants?" As in all companies in our regiment, men were lined up by height for conformity. First platoon of Company H was composed of 6-footers or above. I stood 6'2½ myself. Jokingly, I said, "Oh, we're just a bunch of North Dakota farmers." As we turned inland, west of Gavaga Creek, I noticed 4 Marines hunkered down beside an 81 mm mortar. We had been given no information, and I was never privy to what was planned. We knew the Japanese were near Tetere, and we were to assist the Marines in destroying them. That was all I had been told. If any plans had been made, the commander of Company G had not passed them on to me. This was like the blind leading the blind. Company F in the lead was the first to encounter the enemy in a vicious fight, man to man. They were instantly pinned down and could not advance. The Japanese were endeavouring to escape inland, and they fought ruthlessly. Our assignment to Company G left us out of the fight, for the company was thinly stretched all the way from the ocean to Company F. Worried, I walked forward to the Company F command post for information. There I found our Company H mortar officer, Lieutenant Clark. He was unable to use his mortars for lack of direction in the heavy jungle. Just then a mortar round burst inside the Fox command post, wounding several men. I lucked out, but Clark's wounds were fatal. Fragments from the mortar shell proved it to be one of our own 81 mm projectiles. Before returning to my platoon, I stopped at the battalion aid station to pick up an M1 rifle from the stack left by the wounded. The Company F fight went on all afternoon and well into the evening before things quieted down. When daylight finally came, the captain of Company G ordered me out in front to cross Gavaga Creek and close the gap. I looked at him, hardly able to believe my ears. A machine gun platoon carrying guns and ammo, leading a patrol for a rifle company. I knew a coward when I saw one. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He knew of the losses Company F had suffered. He was not going to risk himself or his men. I was to be the sacrificial lamb. Later, this captain was reprimanded severely for his act. He held it against me for 2.5 more years of combat. I led off as ordered and soon encountered abandoned Japanese equipment left from Company F's firefight of the previous afternoon. I was led man and fully expected to be ambushed at any moment. Visibility in this heavy jungle was limited to about 15 feet. Eventually we encountered water and waded on. Finally it reached to our armpits. After about 200 yards of this, I heard a man yelling in the distance. There was no mistaking the voice of Lieutenant Ben Osborne, platoon leader of Company E. It was high-pitched and squeaky. It's funny how you can recognize a voice at times. This one had a timbre all its own. I yelled, "Benny! Benny! Easy! Easy!" In the distance I heard a reply and identified myself, lest his platoon on the other side of Gavaga Creek decide we were Japanese. We worked another 100 yards east and came out of the water to find we had crossed the creek. Here, just as we reached dry land, we found a heavily travelled trail leading inland. Japanese General Shoji and his group of 2,500 soldiers had escaped our trap. They had also escaped from our troops pressing in from the far side of the creek. Evidently the enemy had tried the west side, but Company F had blocked the route. Arguments and tension among the command of this operation resulted in General Sebré relieving our battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Art Timbo, of his command. It seemed someone had to take the blame for the failure of this grandiose plan cooked up by the brass, a plan that had little or no chance of succeeding because of stretched lines covered by too few men. This action of Sebré's was totally unjustified, for we had inadequate men to complete an encirclement. If Company F had not run into a massive fight, perhaps the closure could have been accomplished. Yet General Shoji had nearly 2,500 desperate men. It is highly unlikely that we could have held him with our thin line. We followed the trail north and found the hard-pressed enemy had left nearly all of their supplies. Artillery ammunition was strewn everywhere, deemed too heavy to carry by the Japanese soldiers. Near the beach was a 75 mm gun, minus a breech block. Folding boats of plywood with rubber joints lay on the beach by the dozens. About the only thing we didn't find was edible food. There were many sacks of rice, but from experience we knew it was heavily contaminated with mice and rat excreta. We were hungry, but not that hungry. I found a small pineapple, which I shared. My hunger pangs totally disappeared after about 24 hours without food. In the next 7 days, my total food intake would be one 300-calorie chocolate bar. Few of my men would fare better, although we would manage to get adequate drinking water. Whoever was in charge of this operation was derelict in all aspects. Famous schools often produce famous fools. The village of Tetere consisted of 2 or 3 tumble-down huts. We discovered many dug-in shelters, which were reconnoitred with a hand grenade for safety. In the afternoon of November 12th, we received urgent orders to move back to the longer perimeter. As we broke out to the beach, we finally saw our Navy ships in the distant west. We found later they had escorted the 182nd Infantry Regiment of our American Division to Guadalcanal. Just as we rounded Coley Point, we heard several aircraft approaching. Looking east, I counted 21 Japanese torpedo bombers skimming the waves in a long broadside line. As they passed by us, I borrowed one half of a Japanese binocular from McCarthy, who had found that portion while scrounging at Tetere. The view was exciting. The sky was littered with black dots of AA shells from naval guns. Our Cactus Air Force was having a ball. One by one, the torpedo bombers blew up or hit the water. I was able to see the entire show until McCarthy asked for his half binocular. One aircraft escaped. It climbed slowly for altitude and turned toward the north. Moments later, we first heard, then saw an F-4F miles behind him, going full bore. Some minutes later, a column of black smoke appeared on the horizon, and the F-4F leisurely returned. The long walk back to the perimeter was slow. We were so weak from lack of food that we could walk only 100 to 200 yards before dropping to rest. I threatened only one man. He was so exhausted he just gave up. Boosted by my threats of violence, he made it. When about 2.5 miles from the perimeter, we watched a C-47 as it left Henderson Field, climbing out over the ocean. It was at an altitude of about 600 feet when it suddenly disappeared in a white flash. From our vantage point, we could see no debris falling. It was a mystery, for there were no other aircraft or any AA smoke in the area. We arrived at the perimeter a bit before dark, greeted by our mess sergeant, who had moved his kitchen to the closest edge of the line for our convenience. We removed our helmet liners and wiped out the steel to use for mess kits. The mixture ladled into it was almost like fool's stew, but it tasted great, warm and filling. To the men, the fiasco at Coley Point later became known as the Coley Point Rat Race. It did not endear us to the Marine Command. The best part followed. Our supply sergeant had bags and bags of mail, a 2-month supply for me, 52 letters. There was a problem, though. By this time it was dark, and the Japanese fleet was expected at any moment. At least now we had a navy, or part of one. It was a bit past 1:30 a.m. on Friday, November 13th, when the show started. The big ships fired shell after shell while we watched from the beach. The projectiles could be followed readily as the missiles glowed. They arched up out of the big guns at 20, to 30-degree angles, exploding miles away with brilliant flashes. It was like a giant fireworks display, but deadly. The main battle lasted about an hour, but we heard more distant shooting at dawn. Soon thereafter, a few miles offshore, the bottom of a large ship could be seen, still floating, so close that we figured it was one of ours. Crews in small boats were picking up survivors, American and Japanese, and bringing them to the beach. I watched as they walked to the dispensary about 300 yards inland. These men were covered with a thick, viscous tar. As they unloaded from the landing craft and walked to medical aid, there was no fight left in them. They were just glad to be alive. Many were blinded by the tar-like substance and needed to be led. The several Japanese sailors seemed despondent, harmless, their part in the war over. Strange to say, they were walking unguarded among the casualties, even helping them. Later, I found they were moved to Sydney, Australia, to a prison camp. When I got to my bundle of letters, I scanned them hurriedly and found my wife had had twins, a boy and a girl, but the boy had died just before birth. I was angry because my wife had gone to the old family doctor. I had objected. I wanted her to go to a clinic, but was overruled. This doctor was so old he shouldn't have been practicing. He hadn't even known she was carrying twins. Our perimeter was far from being out of the woods. We watched aircraft from Henderson Field fly out past Savo Island, group after group. Word came that they were after the Japanese battleship Hiei, which had been crippled during the previous night's naval battle. The flyers were determined to put her under. Word also leaked of a possible massive Japanese reinforcement of troops to our west sometime during the night. The good news was that the 182nd Infantry of our Americal Division had landed safely at Kukum. Late in the afternoon, we moved to a quiet bivouac area east of the airport, about half a mile distant. I had been told that before bombs were dropped from the twin-engined Bettys, you could hear the clicks of the bomb release mechanism. About midnight, I discovered this to be true. A flight of several bombers was heard at high altitude, gradually approaching the airfield. As they reached overhead, we heard several audible click, click, clicks from far above. Seconds later, we heard the growing swish of the bomb strings. Unfortunately, the bombs dropped into our new cemetery, just west of the main runway, quite near the ocean. As I looked the burial location over the next morning, I wondered how Graves Registration would ever sort out this mess. Deep, water-filled bomb craters were everywhere. On Saturday, I was ordered to the beach with Company H to supervise the unloading of gasoline drums and cargo. The fenced-off area of beach had a gate guard of Marines. It encompassed about 10 acres. Cargo ships near shore dropped 55-gallon drums of gasoline into the ocean, and the prevailing onshore winds blew them to the beach. Our job was to roll the drums from the water onto planking, then load them into 6-by-6-foot trucks for movement inland to safety. Just at noon, LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, and LCMs, landing craft medium, came in with a large number of orange crates and boneless steak meat, the meat frozen solid in frost-covered boxes. I asked the quartermaster officer at the gate where the trucks were going. He laughed. "Hell, it's all going to Marine Division headquarters, where else? You'll never see a bit of it." I was angry as I walked out the gate to our service company, where I knew a truck driver. I asked him if he could get a 6-by-6-foot truck and slip into the long line of quartermaster trucks. That afternoon, our battalion shared 2 truckloads of oranges and 2 truckloads of boneless steak meat. When our regular ration issue came, we received no oranges or steak meat. The quartermaster officer was so right. At the time, I was reminded of the old army adage, "The Lord helps those who help themselves, but Lord help those who get caught helping themselves."